better understand the domestic dynamics in our countries. I think just as our guests from South Africa and Brazil are here, and they may have questions about the domestic dynamics in India. And if they have questions, we should be ready to answer them. This is an academic forum. This is not a group of officials who's talking to each other. By the same token, I think the other two countries, South Africa and Brazil, this is an occasion for us to learn as to what is the thinking about what should be done about South-South cooperation. South-South cooperation, we can talk for 2 hours without saying much. But let us try to understand what really is doable. And in that context, I think if we hear more from our Brazilian and South African colleagues about the domestic dimension, that would be very helpful. But at this stage, let me now invite Professor Boiler-Muller, who is the lead discussant, who has been furiously taking notes for the last an hour and a half. And so, in her capacity as discussant, she is going to help the chair immensely in order to carry forward this dialogue. Madam.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair. Am I on? That's right. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you very much.
Hold the mic closer to yourself.
Closer?
Closer, yeah.
It keeps switching on and off. Okay. Thank you very much to esteemed Chair, Ambassador Bhatia, for posing some really important questions at the beginning of the session. And thank you also to the speakers, Professors Gumeri, Lima, and Charlia, for addressing some of these questions and also for putting some more questions on the table. But there are also some answers that have emerged during the session, and I'd like to try and distill some of that, some kind of thread that's been running through this discussion around global governance and the role of IBSA. So what we need, and this was said right at the beginning, and it's been said from this morning, is that we need fresh ideas. Obviously, there's been a hiatus, and we haven't really been thinking creatively about what can be done about IBSA. But what is important also, besides these fresh ideas, is that we need to pass them on to the Sherpas, who are meeting in parallel, as has been mentioned. And besides this, there's one step further, in that we require political chemistry of the three leaders of our countries for us to be successful with IBSA. Now, we've heard about the kind of chemistry that's existed in the past, and we're not sure about the chemistry that is existing now or going into the future. All right, so there are some questions around the new president of Brazil. But he's very new, so some of the conclusions that we draw are preliminary conclusions about the approach of the Brazilian president to both BRICS and IBSA and all the other multilateral fora in which Brazil operates. But it is clear that he is very keen to maintain close relationships with the United States. And if I may, it represents sort of the new strongman approach to international relations and global governance that has emerged with Donald Trump, and also a leaning to the right. So that's one question, and it's been raised by the panel. And also then we have elections in South Africa next week on the 8th of May, and the results will be announced on the 9th of May. We have quite a good idea of the party who will be successful. There will be some changes, I think, in percentages, but we're more than likely going to have a new president inaugurated soon. And by all means, it would be President Cyril Ramaphosa. And we know from history that President Ramaphosa, well, sort of acting president at the moment, but Cyril Ramaphosa has played a big role in the liberation struggle and the crafting of the South African Constitution, and is very keen to strengthen South-South relations, but also human rights focused international relations and multilateralism. He worked along with our former president, Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, when President Mandela was saying that South Africa should be a beacon to the world in terms of human rights. Simultaneously, President Mandela was saying that we should be friends with everyone. So it was an interesting approach in that we were to be a beacon, but simultaneously that we would be friends with everyone, which makes South Africa quite unique in that even North Korea is a friend of South Africa. So then we also have the elections that are happening in India right now, a much longer process than the one in South Africa, and the outcome will be on the 23rd of May, and by all means and purposes, President Modi will remain in power. So what would be the chemistry there between those three leaders? And we need to make sure then that the chemistry is crafted in such a way that there would be an understanding of what is happening within both IBSA and with BRICS. Although we have less to say about IBSA, and it's a real pity because of this sort of dormancy that's occurred. It was also mentioned that this was really the very first alliance in favor of the peoples of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So it's truly the democratic countries of the South. It's truly Southern. It's not sort of half South, half North. And there was this interesting development around China wanting to join IBSA. IBSA rejecting this, and then BRICS emerging from that. So IBSA joined BRICS in a sense. But IBSA maintains its fundamental principles and values that are expressed in the Brasilia Declaration of 2003. But will these principles and values outlive the tectonic shifts that are happening globally? So can we find consensus-based answers in uncertain times, very uncertain times? So let me try and address some of the questions. I don't have all the answers, and in fact my answers are probably not 100% correct, but just some ideas around the answers to the 6 questions that were posed by the ambassador. And that is, and I've mentioned this, what do we do in this global context that has changed significantly since 2003? There's a protectionism, a new industrial revolution, and issues around maritime security that are becoming very prominent within the global context. Well, first of all, there should be a pushback against protectionism. And of course, there should be a response that is positive around the Industrial Revolution. We need to work towards ensuring that we develop positive approaches to this industrial revolution that has come. And I know that India, for a long time already, has been preparing for this, and it is a big discussion in the G20 at the moment. Japan is leading, and they're very concerned about issues like artificial intelligence. With regards to maritime security, IBSA has a really important role, I believe, to play here. But not only maritime peace and security in the traditional sense of the word. At the moment, I happen to be chair of the Indian Ocean Rim Association academic group, And the academic agenda that I've been pushing, and other colleagues from South Africa, and in particular India, Australia, Indonesia, and the small island states, is the blue economy. So I would really strongly suggest that this be a fresh idea for IBSA to consider. The blue economy is not only about exploitation, so that's why we don't call it the ocean economy. It is about ensuring the sustainability of whatever we do with our oceans. So the maritime security issue, I think, needs to be expanded to include all other aspects of the blue economy, because IBSA has been saying, since the MDGs are now into the SDGs, that we really do believe in the sustainability agenda of the that has been a global consensus. So the role and relevance of IBSA, I've just mentioned the SDGs at the moment. We really need to work together to ensure that we move towards the realization of the SDGs, but not only some, all. And that's why I mentioned the blue economy, that's SDG 14, which relates to life under the sea. But of course, life related to the sea, life dependent on the sea and the oceans. The difficult question, the third question, comparison and competition between IBSA and BRICS. Well, South Africa joined BRICS in 2013. And that was upon invitation of China to our former President Jacob Zuma, who was actually pushing, everybody knows, behind the scenes to become a member of BRICS. It was very important for South Africa to become a gateway to Africa in terms of China's agenda in Africa around trade and infrastructure development. And since then, IBSA has faded in the academic minds of South Africans, is also, and in the political circles that we have in South Africa. So BRICS has been sort of an obsession in some way for South Africans, but both positive and negative. In other words, we can benefit a lot, especially from China's investments. And they've even pulled South Africa into the Belton Road initiative, although we are not part of the historical roots of the land and marine, the Silk Road. China has decided to open it up. So initially it was called the One Belt, One Road initiative, and now it's called the Belton Road initiative because China is opening up this initiative. As mentioned, they have $1 trillion invested in this, and anybody who buys into the principles of the Belton Road initiative may join. But of course, there is a pushback against this with things like the Indo-Pacific emerging as a new area that is to some extent meant to bypass some of what is happening there with China's Belton Road initiative. So since the academic group last met, I think somebody said in 2011, I haven't been at an IBSA academic group meeting before, but I have been involved with BRICS. The area of discussion, question 4, from the beginning, both within BRICS and IBSA, has been the reform of the United Nations Security Council. But it's been lip service within BRICS. Obviously, China and Russia are not prepared to let go of the veto power that they have within the Security Council. And although there is, on the surface, support for reform, that would be a limited reform, whereas IBSA has always been pushing for a collective vision around the United Nations Security Council, which should be democratized. And this is one thing that we really strongly have in common, and an area where BRICS has failed. In terms of the fifth question, we have a fund in IBSA The IBSA fund is known, but really 31 projects, 37 million US dollars is not enough. It's piffling in terms of what is happening internationally. And was mentioned, you know, the 1 trillion US dollars for the Belton Road Initiative. Of course, our three democracies cannot afford that to invest that amount of money, but surely more than 37 million US dollars, especially for something around 31 projects. So it's very little money to work on those projects. But obviously there's a lot of goodwill behind this, and the projects are of tremendous importance, and in particular have been very successful in the areas of health and education. But I think obviously we need to really put a lot of money and effort into climate change, the environment, pollution, plastics in the oceans and so on. Otherwise, IBSA is going to fall behind in terms of the new global agenda. What are our core areas? So I've made some suggestions around core areas, but of course this will be based on consensus. We need a new balance of power in the world. We still do. And so that's one of the things that needs to be in the forefront of our minds. And the biggest question really here is, what do we do about the crisis of multilateralism? If we believe that there is a crisis of multilateralism, what can IBSA do in the age of Trumpism, the strongman, and nationalism, to ensure that multilateralism succeeds and does not die? We need a problem-solving approach to things like the climate change crisis, and this requires a very strong push towards multilateralism. And so those are the kinds of things that should be at the forefront of our minds, because at the moment we do live in a bipolar world, and I think I mean that in two senses of the word. You know, we're manic depressive in terms of what's going on globally, as well as moving towards a sort of US-China confrontation that is occurring at the moment, and Brazil's movement towards Trumpism that may be of a concern, because they don't want any anti-Western sentiment. But of course, I don't think that even BRICS is looking at that. BRICS as a multilateral body is not necessarily anti-Western, but pro-reform, pro-democracy of the global order. So never mind the fact that some of the countries are not democratic, there is a call for a democratic global order, and that also comes from BRICS. But IBSA has a real advantage in terms of very, very strong South-South cooperation, starting, I think, in the non-aligned movement, you know. So there's a tremendously important history behind all of this. And that this interregional approach, there are no strategic rivalries within IBSA, not many, I'm not aware of any, whereas with BRICS is constant tensions, and I think in particular between India and China. So the idea for IBSA is to be sort of a champion for multilateralism, and for looking at new ways of working in the world, new ways of developing relationships amongst nations and people. And I think that the speakers on this panel and the questions that were posed are very important, and need to be addressed. And we need to ensure that we either say that IBSA has another 20 years ahead of it, or IBSA is part of BRICS, and that's all fine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam. I cannot express enough appreciation for your superb comment and summarizing of such diverse strands of discussion that we have experienced this morning today. I think The one key point eventually once again comes back to what Professor Bawa had said in the morning about the very subtle and nuanced relationship between BRICS and IBSA. And you have pointed out that contradiction which came up through our dialogue this morning, that BRICS seeks a democratization of the global order when it actually does not practice real democracy within itself. So this is a big issue here. I would put it to the audience here that nothing much would be gained by juxtaposing IBSA against BRICS. Because if we say that they too represent antithesis, then clearly BRICS is far more powerful and IBSA will not be able to fly off. Then what is the way? My submission to you is that the way is that the two bodies are complementary to each other. We have to project the conviction that a stronger IBSA will help BRICS to become stronger and more balanced. That is the critical phrase here. Because after 10 years of this great enthusiasm for BRICS has now brought us to a situation where we have begun to realize the limitations of BRICS. And therefore, if we want a more balanced, more reformed multilateral order, then time has come when IBSA will have to be more purposeful, more result-oriented, more infused with new ideas for the next decade. I think this is what is coming up. But at this stage, allow me first, before I open the floor for discussion, to invite Dr. Menon, who is here from Kerala, who is specializing in the issues of health and on global governance, to address us for 10 minutes or so, and then we can have a discussion involving all of you. Dr. Menon, thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Bhatia, and thanks, Professor Sachin, for having me here. Now, one area of convergence that I see between the three countries in the area of the healthcare sector, all of you all would agree that...
technicians, something seemed to be burning. Can you just make sure that there's no problem? Yeah, they just... Might explode. Just switch it off, I think. Switch it off. Yeah, good. Thank you. Please carry on.
I do understand that this room, the think tank from these three nations, are drawn from political sciences, economics, and I'm probably the lone doctor here. But I would try to make a case out for the healthcare sector. All three nations are faced with the same set of problems, whether it be South Africa, whether it be Brazil or India. Middle of the last century, when India gained independence, the problems that Brazil, India and South Africa faced were what we call the communicable diseases, that is polio, diarrheal diseases. These were the leading causes of death and morbidity. 50 years hence, that is whether it be in India or Brazil, the leading causes of death, morbidity and mortality in our citizens are non-communicable diseases. When we say non-communicable diseases, it's a whole set of diseases including cancers, respiratory diseases and cardiovascular disease. I wouldn't know the statistic for South Africa, but about 40 to 45% of death and morbidity in Brazil and India is related to heart disease, strokes or peripheral vascular disease. So I think that's an area of interest for all of our three countries, and a good starting point to this would be the sustainable developmental goals that have been charted out by the WHO for all respective countries. We have something called the 25-25 program, in which we have to see that there's a decrease in tobacco consumption by 25% in our respective countries, or not in our countries, in countries at large. And also we have to have the means of being able to identify the risk factors of non-communicable diseases. When I say this, The leading cause of death, like I mentioned before, is cardiovascular disease. And the reason for cardiovascular disease is diabetes, hypertension, and a high cholesterol. So what happens in our respective countries is this goes undiagnosed till somebody comes with disease. So it is with this in mind that the WHO has started this 25-25 program, that is, you'll be able to diagnose new cases of hypertension, diabetes, or high cholesterol, that is dyslipidemia, 25% by the year 2025, and this has been ratified by the what do I say? That's based in New York. Not the WHO, the UN. The UN has actually ratified this also. So this would be a good starting block for all of us to start out as to how we pool our respective resources and be compliant with the SDG goals of the WHO. And coming to specifics, there are certain diseases that concern all of us. For example, neglected tropical diseases. Having said that, South Africa doesn't come in the tropics. But this is a list of about 17 or 18 diseases which is most rampant in the African subcontinent. For example, snake bite. You have a whole lot of deaths occurring due to snake bite, about 1 lakh of them every year. 100,000 people die of snake bite worldwide, out of which about 50,000 die in India. And a vast majority of the rest are in sub-Saharan Africa. And coming to specifics, the manufacturers of anti-snake venom, which is the only treatment for snake bite, no longer produce anti-snake venom for the sub-Saharan population. So it's Indian manufacturers that are actually manufacturing anti-snake venom for Africa. But we don't have those same set of snakes there, which are abundant there. We don't see them in India. So the quality of manufacture is likely to be, not up to the mark. So there are so many areas that you could actually work on, and where there is expertise in certain areas which is available in Brazil, which is not there in India, and vice versa. So again, what I would think is healthcare is a good area of convergence for all three countries, and we could definitely decide on certain startups or areas where we could start on, and SDGs for non-communicable diseases would be a good starting area, as also neglected tropical diseases. Because why I keep saying about neglected tropical diseases is we don't have to do any real research on HIV or coronary stents or diabetes, because the Western world, which is so far ahead of us in all these three areas, they're already doing it for us. Snakebite doesn't exist for that matter in the US or Australia or the Western countries. So there are certain diseases which are common to all our three countries where we could pool our resources. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, I really appreciate, Dr. Menon, your intervention. I'm glad you brought us down to the hard reality. I think the Sherpa was asking for a fresh idea in the morning, and I think you have just provided it. I think earlier Professor Cholia was talking about the cooperation in the education sector. You have very rightly and graphically pointed out the significance of these two areas, specific areas. I think we should indeed bring this in with regard to our core areas. I think, dear friends, I just want to say that I think we need a bit more discussion on the core areas, because as you recall, and I mentioned, Brasilia Declaration talked about 6 broad areas, and since then there was proliferation, but now the world has changed. Madam very rightly mentioned about the blue economy. This already, I think, struck the policy makers in IBSA last year when or in 2017, when they decided to make a separate probably working group on blue economy, although probably it has not yet started working. Therefore, I would particularly welcome, among other responses to all the points which have been made, to your suggestions and ideas as to what 4, 5, 6, 10 areas we can recommend collectively and through consensus to the IBSA leadership. And clearly, education and health, I hope, and blue economy also, would come in one form or the other there. So at this stage, may I request the audience to please feel free. This is not a session where you have to ask questions. You are welcome to ask them, but you also please feel free to make your comments and observations. Well, let me invite Madame Elizabeth Sidoropoulos to, pay the price for coming so late to the conference and oblige us with her perceptive remarks.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Ambassador Bhatia. I will have a discussion after this about putting me on the spot. But no, seriously, I think this has been a really a great panel, and on many of the points that were raised around the importance of IBSA in the current geopolitical context, I think I would largely agree. Perhaps let me try to add to some of the points that have been made, also in response to your questions that you posed. I think really excellent questions at the beginning. And on the point about not using the two groupings, BRICS and IBSA, as a